Yeah, I would say that the Black Lives Matter organising project in the UK is very needed because we live in a context of anti-blackness and anti-black racism, and so we're organising around the injustices that we receive as black people and as people of colour more generally in the UK.
Talk to us, if you would, Kadija, about your own story and the problems that your family have encountered.
Well, my cousin Shekubayo he died in police custody on the 3rd of May 2015. And the first I heard about it was the next day, and my cousin, who has the same name as me, called me and said, small Sheku has died. And I said, how? He's 31, what's gone on? And she described this absolute horror story of how the police had turned up at her house 5 times within a space of about 5 hours, giving 5 different versions of the story of how he had been arrested. At that time, they didn't even say that he was actually dead. They didn't know he was dead until the middle of the afternoon, and in fact, he died in the morning when they had gone out after being called to say there's a man on the street with a knife. They saw my cousin. This is what we believe happened. They saw my cousin. They assumed it was him who had the knife. No knife has ever been found. And he was restrained. And by the time he got to the hospital, he was dead. Well, in fact, he never got up. After he was restrained, he never actually got up again. But he was restrained with irons, as if he was a slave, and taken to a hospital.
And of course, that's one case. There are many cases, but yes, it goes beyond the relationship between black people and police in this country, doesn't it? The whole movement. Why do you think it is so important for people in the UK to embrace this movement as they have so embraced it in the US?
Because simply because it happens in the UK. There have been nobody has been condemned for this. No, there's been absolutely nobody has been, for all of the cases that have happened in the UK, there have been no convictions. This has been thousands of people who've been through something like this since the early 90s, and there's been absolutely no convictions whatsoever. People need to realise this happens in the UK all of the time. In state institutions, it happens. And just because it's not a gun, a lot of the times it could be, any other form of restraint, and people are not aware that it's happening.
I mean, I'm sure lots of people would say the IPCC here isn't here to defend itself, and I'm sure lots of people who work in institutions would say this absolutely does not happen every day. But I understand the point that you're trying to make is that there are questions that need to be asked of certain incidents. And as you were speaking then, Toyin, you were nodding at some of the points that Kadija was making.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's funny because today is the Olympics in Rio, and you think in 1968, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, the Black Power Fist for the Olympic Project for Human Rights, they made it clear that we had to be involved in addressing these issues. Now, that was in 1968. We've had the Human Rights Act in 1998. We've had the abolishment of the CRE in 1978, 2007, sorry. And we're in a situation right now, after a Brexit vote, we've got increased racism inside the UK. And people are saying that we don't need a Black Lives Matter movement. Now, the reality is that people like Khadija's cousin, is being killed. We have people passing away from positional asphyxia. The IPC I think it's common knowledge it's ineffective.
And in Scotland it's even more ineffective, which is called the perk.
It's called the perk.
It's called the perk. It's not exactly the same as it is in England. It's called the perk.
So we've got to acknowledge that we need a movement that actually recognises the fact that this is a normalised form of terrorism that we experience.
Do you think that, I've spoken to so many people from the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, and they've told me that it's just overt racism in the US that they experience day in, day out. Do you think in the UK it's more hidden, and that's why people are saying, we don't need this movement here?
It is more covert.
It is more hidden, but I think what's happened with the recent Brexit vote is that people have been more emboldened now. I mean, we had 57% increase in racist attacks. We've had 2% of the population voting to kick out the migrants. And I know everyone's saying it was an economic decision.
Well, not everyone who voted Brexit were voting to kick out the migrants.
And that's what I just said that. But I said, but the whole thrust of that campaign was to get rid of migrants. And what happens is that if you're an African person walking down the street, and this happens to me personally, you're walking down the street and you're seeing young people being harassed and they're being humiliated, stopped and searched for no good reason. They're not being arrested afterwards, but they are being demonised, they're being humiliated. there is a cause to recognise that there's something in society that's quite ugly, that's festering, that's growing. And Black Lives Matter just simply says, treat us with dignity and invoke justice. There has to be some kind of effect, there has to be some kind of like a penalty if someone's lost their life. And we know that when the EU campaign started, one of the big things was this anti-human rights kind of like mantra that happened. Now, one of the things about the human rights mantra is the right to life. Another thing is a right to no torture. As an African, I grew up as a young person in Britain watching what happened in Tanzania or South Africa. That was terrorising. And then to be in the UK and to be stopped and searched and harassed and locked up, and I've been beaten up by police officers, and then to see my sons and my daughter go through the same experience.
So do you tell your sons and daughters to behave in a certain way if they are stopped by police? Is that an ordinary thing to do here? Because I know it happens in the States.
I think what you're referring to is respectability politics, which is this sort of idea that depending on how we behave, we can somehow save ourselves from being abused by police and state institutions. But that's really not the case. Yeah. And it's really important that no matter how we behave, it's really important that the public know and that the police know that we get killed anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
What support do you want? Because when I've spoken to people in the US from your movement, they've said actually white people need to use their privilege rather than just standing there with banners saying we support you. They need to say actually this has to stop. Is that the sort of action and support that you would want to hear? Absolutely. I think being silent on issues such as this is really complicit. It's about complicity in a racist, state-sanctioned, violent situation for black people. I would say that a lot of white people have been very vocal in anti-racist movements, but there needs to be an intentionality around being led by people of colour, by black people in the UK who have been saying the same things for very many years. You know, I've just been rereading Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, right? The anti-immigration sentiment that you were talking about earlier, and the 57% increase in racist street harassment since Brexit is nothing new, okay? Yeah. This is not something that we're just realising, it's something that has been part of the colonial project of Britain since its inception.
Can I add on that?
Very briefly.
There's right now we're in the UN's International Decade of African People, and the British government was asked, what are you doing to commemorate this decade? Nothing. And that's part of the problem. People condemn the movement.
So you want acknowledgement from...
We want action, more than just a talk and racism is bad kind of speech. We want action.
Okay, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there because I want to bring you, we've got a statement from the IPCC, which I'm sure you'll be interested to hear. Dame Anne Hours, who's the chair of the IPCC, has said in a statement, custody staff should be professionally valued within the police service, with support and training for the challenging role they take on. It's equally vital that other police officers and staff are able to recognise and act on vulnerability when making an arrest or prioritising police response in a call centre. As our investigations and HMIC's inspections show, forces do not always have a clear and consistent understanding of vulnerability and how to manage it.